The journey to Denver began before dawn, with Thomas and Carmen traveling in his old pickup truck down winding mountain roads still shrouded in morning mist. Carmen sat quietly beside him, clutching a small leather portfolio containing the evidence that had forced her to flee Mexico. Both of them understood that this trip would determine not just her future, but potentially their lives as well. Thomas had spent most of the previous night thinking about their situation and had developed a plan that he hoped would protect Carmen while ensuring the evidence reached the right authorities. Through his service in World War II, he still maintained contact with a former Army intelligence officer named Robert Hayes who now worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Denver. If anyone could be trusted with sensitive information involving international corruption, it would be Hayes. As they descended from the mountains toward the city, Carmen finally broke the silence that had settled between them. Thomas, I need you to understand something before we do this. Once we turn over this evidence, there's no going back. Martinez will know that someone has the documents, and he'll assume it was me. Even if the FBI protects my identity, he'll keep looking until he finds me. Thomas glanced at her, noting the resignation in her voice. Are you having second thoughts? About exposing Martinez? No. About involving you in this mess? Yes. Carmen turned in her seat to face him fully. It's not too late for you to drop me off somewhere in Denver and go back to your ranch. You could forget you ever met Carmen Rodriguez and get on with your life. Thomas was quiet for several minutes, focusing on navigating the increasingly busy roads as they approached the city. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a conviction that surprised even him. 6 months ago, I placed an advertisement for a wife because I was lonely and tired of living isolated on that ranch, he said. I thought I needed someone to cook and clean and maybe give me children. But these past few days with you have shown me something different. He pulled the truck over to the side of the road and turned to look directly at Carmen. What I really needed wasn't a housekeeper or even a wife in the traditional sense. What I needed was someone who could challenge me, someone who could make me want to be better than I am, someone worth fighting for. Carmen felt tears forming in her eyes. Thomas, I'm not saying this because I expect anything from you, he continued. I know this whole situation started as a deception, and I understand if you can never see me as anything more than someone who helped you when you needed it. But I want you to know that helping you feels like the most important thing I've ever done. Carmen reached across the seat and took his hand. You are a remarkable man, Thomas Mitchell. Elena would have been very lucky to have you as a husband. Maybe, Thomas said with a slight smile. But I'm beginning to think I'm the lucky one. Elena would have been a fine wife, I'm sure, but she wouldn't have brought this kind of purpose into my life. They arrived in Denver as the city was coming to life, with office workers hurrying along sidewalks and streetcars clanging through intersections. Thomas navigated to the federal building downtown, an imposing structure that housed several government agencies, including the FBI field office. Robert Hayes met them in a small conference room on the 3rd floor. He was a tall, lean man with graying hair and the kind of steady demeanor that came from years of dealing with sensitive information. Thomas had called ahead to arrange the meeting, providing only the vague details that he had information about corruption involving American businesses operating in Mexico. Tom, good to see you again, Hayes said, shaking hands with both of them. It's been too long since we've been in touch. Bob, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us, Thomas replied. This is Carmen Rodriguez. She has information that I think will interest the Bureau. Hayes gestured for them to sit as he opened a notebook. Before we begin, I need to establish a few ground rules. Anything you tell me here today will be treated as confidential until we determine that it relates to ongoing criminal activity. If it does, we may need to ask Ms. Rodriguez to provide formal testimony at some point. Carmen nodded, understanding the implications. I'm prepared for that possibility, Agent Hayes. Good. Now, why don't you tell me what kind of information you have? Carmen began her story from the beginning, explaining her background as a teacher in Mexico City, her witnessing of Colonel Martinez accepting bribes, and the threats that had forced her to flee the country. Hayes listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly focusing intently on her words. When Carmen finished her account and produced the documents from her portfolio, Hayes examined them carefully. The photographs clearly showed Martinez accepting large sums of money from men in business suits, and the copied documents detailed land transactions that appeared to be fraudulent. Ms. Rodriguez, Hayes said after reviewing everything, "This is indeed serious information. If these documents are authentic, they indicate violations of several U.S. laws regarding foreign business practices and possibly money laundering." "They're authentic," Carmen assured him. "I saw these transactions take place with my own eyes." Hayes nodded, setting the papers aside. "The challenge we face is that Colonel Martinez operates primarily in Mexico, which limits our jurisdiction. However, if American companies and citizens are involved in these corrupt activities, that gives us grounds to investigate and potentially prosecute." "What does that mean for Carmen's safety?" Thomas asked. "That's a more complicated question," Hayes admitted. "If we move forward with an investigation based on this information, we'll need Ms. Rodriguez's cooperation and testimony. We can provide some protection, but we can't guarantee her safety indefinitely, especially if the people she's exposed have the kind of resources and reach she's described." Carmen had expected this answer, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill through her. "What are my options?" Hayes leaned back in his chair, considering. "We could arrange for you to enter a witness protection program once any legal proceedings are completed. That would mean a new identity, relocation to a different part of the country, severing all ties with your previous life, including any relationships you've formed since coming to the United States." The implication was clear. If Carmen entered witness protection, she would have to leave Thomas and disappear permanently. It would be as if Carmen Rodriguez had never existed. "There might be another option," Hayes continued thoughtfully. "If we can build a strong enough case against the American companies involved in this corruption, we might be able to pressure the Mexican government to take action against Martinez. If he's arrested and prosecuted in Mexico, the threat to Ms. Rodriguez would be significantly reduced." "How long would that take?" Thomas asked. "Months, possibly longer," Hayes admitted. "Building a case like this requires extensive investigation, coordination with Mexican authorities, and careful documentation of evidence. During that time, Ms. Rodriguez would need to remain hidden and protected." Carmen looked at Thomas, seeing the concern in his expression. They had known this wouldn't be simple, but the reality of the situation was even more daunting than they had imagined. "There's one more thing I should mention," Hayes added. "The fact that Ms. Rodriguez entered the country using false documentation complicates her legal status here. Technically, she's in the United States illegally." Thomas felt his heart sink. "What does that mean?" "It means that even after this investigation is resolved, Ms. Rodriguez could face deportation proceedings unless we can find a legal basis for her to remain in the country." Carmen closed her eyes, feeling the weight of all the obstacles arrayed against her. Every solution seemed to create new problems. Every option came with devastating trade-offs. "However," Hayes continued, "there are legal precedents for granting asylum to individuals who face persecution for exposing corruption, especially when that corruption involves American interests. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible." Thomas reached over and took Carmen's hand. "What do we need to do?" "First, I need Ms. Rodriguez to provide a formal statement about everything she witnessed, with as much detail as possible. Then, we'll need to begin the process of verifying the authenticity of these documents and identifying the American companies and individuals involved. While we're doing that, you'll both need to return to Colorado and wait." "Is it safe for Carmen to go back to the ranch?" Thomas asked. "Probably safer than staying in a city where she might be more easily located," Hayes replied. "Your property is isolated, and as far as anyone knows, Elena Vasquez is living there as your mail-order bride. Just be vigilant and report anything unusual immediately." Over the next several hours, Carmen provided her formal statement to Agent Hayes and a stenographer, recounting every detail she could remember about Martinez's activities and the American businessmen involved. The process was emotionally exhausting, forcing her to relive the fear and trauma that had driven her from Mexico. As they prepared to leave Denver, Hayes pulled Thomas aside. "Tom, I want you to understand what you're getting into here. These corruption cases can drag on for years, and they often attract dangerous attention. Ms. Rodriguez seems like a fine woman, and her information could help stop serious criminal activity. But protecting her is going to require significant sacrifice from both of you. Thomas nodded solemnly. I understand, Bob, but it's the right thing to do. Just make sure you're prepared for how hard it might get, Hayes warned. And stay in touch. If anything unusual happens, anything at all, I want to know about it immediately. The drive back to the ranch was quieter than the trip to Denver had been. Both Thomas and Carmen were processing what they had learned and what lay ahead for them. The investigation would take months or possibly years to resolve, during which time Carmen would essentially be in hiding. Her future in America was uncertain, dependent on the success of the FBI's case and the complex immigration proceedings that would follow. I'm sorry, Thomas, Carmen said as they climbed back into the mountains. When I stepped off that train, I never imagined I would be asking you to sacrifice so much. You're not asking me to sacrifice anything, Thomas replied. I'm choosing to help because it's what Elena would have wanted me to do, and because it's what you deserve. Elena? Carmen looked at him with surprise. Thomas smiled slightly. I've been thinking about her a lot these past few days. Elena may never have made it to Colorado, but, in a strange way, she still kept her promise to be my mail-order bride. She sent me you instead, and that might have been the greatest gift she could have given either of us. Carmen felt fresh tears forming as she considered the truth in Thomas's words. Elena had indeed kept her promise, just not in the way any of them had expected. As they reached the ranch that evening, both Thomas and Carmen understood that their relationship had evolved far beyond the simple arrangement that had originally brought them together. They were no longer a lonely rancher and a desperate fugitive thrown together by circumstance. They had become partners in a mission that was bigger than either of them, bound together by shared purpose and growing affection. The months ahead would test their resolve and their relationship in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But, as they sat on Thomas's front porch that night, watching the stars emerge over the Colorado mountains, both felt a sense of peace that had been absent from their lives for far too long. Carmen Rodriguez had indeed told Thomas Mitchell that she wasn't who he thought she was. But, in the process of revealing her true identity, Carmen took another deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she began to reveal the truth that had driven her to Thomas's remote Colorado ranch. The firelight danced across her face, creating shadows that seemed to mirror the darkness of her story. I was never a seamstress, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I was a teacher in Mexico City, at a small school in one of the poorer neighborhoods. My father was a professor at the university, and my mother came from a family of educators. They believed strongly in knowledge, in the power of education to lift people out of poverty. Thomas listened intently, noting how different Carmen sounded now that she was telling the truth. Her words carried the confidence and articulation of someone with genuine education, unlike the simple village girl she had been pretending to be. 3 years ago, I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see, Carmen continued, her gaze fixed on the fire. There was a government official named Colonel Martinez who had been taking bribes from American companies wanting to establish factories in Mexico City. These companies wanted to build on land that belonged to poor families, and Martinez was helping them force people from their homes for a fraction of what the property was worth. She paused, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to ward off a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. One evening, I was staying late at the school to prepare lessons when I saw Martinez meeting with an American businessman in the courtyard next to our building. They thought the area was empty, but my classroom window overlooked the space. I watched Martinez accept a large sum of money in exchange for documents that would allow the businessman's company to claim ownership of an entire neighborhood. Thomas felt a growing sense of dread as he listened to Carmen's story. What did you do? I should have minded my own business, Carmen said bitterly. But I couldn't stand by and watch families lose their homes to corruption. I knew some of those families. Their children attended my school, so I went to the authorities. That was brave of you, Thomas said, though he suspected the story didn't end well. Carmen laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was foolish. The authorities I reported to were either working with Martinez or too frightened of him to take action. Within a week, strange things began happening. Men in dark suits appeared outside the school, watching me. My apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen. I received anonymous notes telling me to keep quiet about what I had seen. She stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness as if those same men might be lurking in the Colorado mountains. When the intimidation didn't work, they became more direct, she continued. One night, two men cornered me on my way home from school. They told me that Colonel Martinez was aware of my interference and that if I didn't leave Mexico City immediately, something unfortunate might happen to me. Thomas joined her at the window, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. So you left the city? I went to stay with Elena in her village, which is where I learned about her correspondence with you. Elena was my father's brother's daughter. We had grown up together, but she had always preferred the simple country life while I pursued education in the city. When I arrived at her village, she was excited about her upcoming marriage to you. She showed me all your letters and talked endlessly about starting a new life in America. Carmen's voice broke slightly as she continued. Elena got sick just a few days after I arrived. The doctor from the next village said it was influenza, but it moved so quickly. Within a week, she was gone. I was devastated, not just because I had lost my cousin, but because her death meant I had nowhere left to hide. Why didn't you write to tell me what had happened? Thomas asked. I intended to, Carmen admitted. I sat down to write the letter several times. But then I realized that Elena's death meant the end of my last hope for escape. If I told you the truth, you would probably find another bride, and I would be left alone in that village with nowhere to go. It was only a matter of time before Martinez's men found me there. She turned to face Thomas, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I know it was wrong to deceive you, but I was desperate. I thought that if I could just get to America, I could start over. I could be the wife Elena would have been, and you would never have to know the difference. Thomas studied her face, seeing the fear and desperation that had driven her to take such a risk. But you're not Elena, he said gently. You're educated, sophisticated. You're nothing like the simple village woman I thought I was marrying. I know, Carmen said, her voice filled with regret. I realized almost immediately that I couldn't maintain the pretense. You're too observant, too intelligent. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you the truth without putting you in danger. What kind of danger? Thomas asked, though he was beginning to understand the implications. Carmen moved away from the window, pacing nervously around the room. Martinez has connections everywhere. If he discovers that I'm in America, if he finds out who helped me get here, he won't hesitate to reach across the border to silence me. There have been incidents before, Mexican officials arranging for troublesome people to disappear even after they've fled to other countries. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. You think he might come here? I don't know, Carmen said honestly. I used Elena's name for everything, her documents for travel. I thought that might provide some protection, make me harder to track. But if he's determined enough, if he has enough resources. She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Thomas realized that by harboring Carmen, he was potentially making himself a target of a corrupt Mexican official with the means and motivation to eliminate threats to his operation. There's something else, Carmen said, her voice dropping even lower. Before Elena died, she told me she had written to you about having information that might be valuable to American authorities. She said she had been vague about it in her letters, but that she planned to tell you everything once she arrived. Thomas frowned, trying to remember Elena's letters. I don't recall anything like that. She was being careful, Carmen explained. She knew that letters could be intercepted, but she had learned from me about Martinez's dealings with American companies, about the bribes and the land theft. She thought that if she could provide evidence to the right people in America, it might help stop what was happening to Mexican families. Do you have this evidence? Thomas asked. Carmen nodded, walking to her small suitcase and removing a hidden compartment from the bottom. Inside were several photographs and documents. Elena insisted that I take these with me. Photographs of Martinez accepting money, copies of forged documents, a list of American companies involved in the scheme. She said it was my duty to see that this information reached people who could act on it. Thomas examined the documents, recognizing the potential explosive nature of what Carmen had brought to his ranch. If these papers documented corruption involving American businesses, they could indeed be valuable to U.S. authorities. They could also make Carmen an even bigger target for elimination. Carmen, he said carefully. If Martinez discovers that you have this evidence, that you've brought it to America, he'll stop at nothing to get it back and silence you permanently. I know, she whispered. That's why I've been so afraid. Every day, I wonder if this will be the day they find me. Thomas set the documents aside and took Carmen's hands in his. They were cold and trembling, and he could feel the weight of fear she had been carrying since her arrival. Why didn't you just turn these over to authorities at the border? He asked. I tried, Carmen said, but I didn't know who to trust. Elena had told me to be careful, that Martinez might have contacts in American border enforcement. I was afraid that if I gave the documents to the wrong person, they might end up back in Martinez's hands, and I would have signed my death warrant for nothing. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, processing everything Carmen had told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm with resolve. We need to get this evidence to people who can act on it, he said, and we need to find a way to protect you in the process. Carmen looked at him with surprise. We? Thomas, you didn't sign up for this when you agreed to marry Elena. You thought you were getting a simple farm wife, not a fugitive carrying dangerous information. I won't blame you if you want me to leave. Thomas stood up and walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames as he considered his options. He could indeed ask Carmen to leave. He could return to his quiet life, maybe find another mail-order bride who would actually be what she claimed to be. It would be the safe choice, the sensible choice. But, as he looked back at Carmen, seeing the fear and hope warring in her expression, he realized that safety and sensibility weren't the only factors to consider. This woman had risked everything to escape danger and seek justice for families being victimized by corruption. She had made mistakes in how she went about it, but her motivations were noble. You're not going anywhere, he said firmly. Tomorrow, we're going to drive to Denver and find someone in federal law enforcement who can help us. And after that, we're going to figure out how to keep you safe. Carmen's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. Thomas, you don't understand what you're offering to do. These people have killed to protect their secrets. They won't hesitate to hurt you too. Maybe not, Thomas admitted. But I understand right from wrong, and I understand that sometimes doing the right thing involves taking risks. He walked back to Carmen and gently took her hands again. Besides, he added with a small smile, I've been alone on this ranch for years. I think I can handle a little excitement. For the first time since her arrival, Carmen smiled genuinely. You're either very brave or very foolish, Thomas Mitchell. Probably both, he agreed. But we're in this together now. Whatever happens next, you're not facing it alone. As they prepared for bed that night, both Thomas and Carmen understood that their lives had irrevocably changed. The simple arrangement that had brought them together had evolved into something much more complicated and dangerous. But it had also revealed strengths and qualities in both of them that neither had expected to find. Carmen lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling and marveling at Thomas's reaction to her confession. She had expected anger, betrayal, rejection. Instead, she had found acceptance and a willingness to stand beside her against forces that could destroy them both. It was more than she had dared to hope for. In his own room, Thomas contemplated the strange turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he had been a simple rancher waiting for his mail-order bride. Now he was planning to take on corrupt officials and protect a woman whose courage and intelligence had already earned his respect, if not his love. Neither of them knew what the next day would bring, but for the first time since Carmen's arrival, both felt that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Thomas Mitchell stood at the train station platform, his worn leather boots shifting nervously against the wooden planks. The autumn wind of 1952 cut through his wool coat as he clutched a faded photograph in his weathered hands. For 6 months, he had exchanged letters with Elena Vasquez, a woman from a small village outside Mexico City who had answered his advertisement in the Denver Post seeking a wife. At 35, Thomas had given up hope of finding love in the traditional way. His ranch in the Colorado mountains was isolated, and the few eligible women in the nearest town had long since married or moved away. His sister Margaret had suggested the mail-order bride arrangement after reading about successful matches in the newspaper. Though hesitant at first, Thomas found himself drawn to Elena's letters, which spoke of her desire for a simple life and her skills in cooking and managing a household. The train's whistle echoed through the valley as it approached the station. Thomas smoothed his hair and adjusted his tie, his heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety. He had sent Elena money for her journey and had prepared the small guest room in his farmhouse for her arrival. According to her letters, she was 26 years old, had worked as a seamstress, and had lost her parents in a fever epidemic 2 years prior. As passengers began stepping off the train, Thomas scanned each face carefully. He expected to see the dark-haired woman from the photograph, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Several women disembarked, but none matched Elena's description. His stomach began to sink as the platform emptied, and still no sign of his intended bride. Just as he was about to approach the conductor to ask if there had been another train, a young woman appeared at the top of the train steps. She was beautiful, with striking dark hair and olive skin, but something about her seemed different from the photograph. She carried herself with a confidence that seemed at odds with the humble, reserved tone of Elena's letters. The woman's eyes found his across the platform, and she walked directly toward him with purposeful strides. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool and carried a small leather suitcase. As she approached, Thomas noticed that while she was indeed beautiful, her features were sharper than in the photograph, and her eyes held an intelligence and wariness that hadn't come through in their correspondence. "You must be Thomas Mitchell," she said, extending her hand in a gesture that seemed more businesslike than romantic. Her English was accented but clear, and her voice held a strength that surprised him. "Yes, and you're Elena," Thomas replied, taking her hand briefly. "I'm pleased to finally meet you. How was your journey?" She hesitated for just a moment before answering. "Long, but uneventful. Thank you for sending the money for my travel. Your letters made the trip seem less daunting." As they walked toward his truck, Thomas found himself stealing glances at his new bride. Something felt different, though he couldn't quite place what it was. Perhaps it was simply that photographs and letters could never truly capture a person's essence. Still, her manner of speaking seemed more educated than he had expected from someone who claimed to have only basic schooling. The drive to his ranch took them through winding mountain roads lined with aspens that had turned golden in the autumn air. Elena sat quietly beside him, gazing out at the landscape with what seemed like careful observation rather than wonder. Thomas had expected questions about the area, comments about its beauty, or perhaps nervous chatter about their upcoming life together. Instead, she remained silent and thoughtful. "It's beautiful country," he offered, hoping to draw her into conversation. "Different from Mexico, I imagine." "Yes, very different," she replied, though her tone suggested she had seen similar terrain before. "The mountains here are quite impressive." Thomas pulled into the dirt road that led to his ranch, past the wooden gate he had repaired just the week before in preparation for her arrival. The house came into view, a modest 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and smoke rising from the chimney. He had spent considerable time cleaning and organizing, wanting to make the best possible impression. "This is it," he said, parking the truck near the front steps. "I know it's not much, but it's comfortable, and the land is good for raising cattle." Elena stepped out of the truck and surveyed the property with keen eyes. She seemed to be cataloging details, noting the barn, the corrals, the condition of the fencing. Her assessment felt more like that of a potential buyer than a woman seeing her new home for the first time. Inside the house, Thomas showed her to the guest room where she would stay until they were properly married. He had arranged for the ceremony to take place the following week, giving them time to get acquainted. The room was simple but clean, with a bed he had made himself, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the valley. "I hope this will be comfortable for you," Thomas said, setting down her suitcase. "We can be married whenever you feel ready. I've spoken with Pastor Williams in town, and he can perform the ceremony any day that suits you." Elena nodded, but again he noticed that hesitation, as if she was weighing her words carefully. "Perhaps we should get to know each other a bit first, as you suggest. Marriage is a significant step." That evening, as Thomas prepared dinner, he found himself more confused than ever. Elena moved through his kitchen with surprising efficiency, seeming to know where things belonged without asking. When he commented on her skill, she explained that all women from her village learned to manage households from a young age. Yet her technique with the cast iron skillet seemed practiced in a way that suggested more than basic domestic training. As they sat down to eat, Thomas attempted to learn more about her background. "Tell me about your village," he said. "What was life like there?" Elena took a careful bite of food before answering. "It was quiet, peaceful. Everyone knew everyone else. We had simple lives, but they were good lives." "And your work as a seamstress? Did you enjoy it?" Again that hesitation. "Yes, it was steady work. I made clothing for the local families, mended what needed mending. It kept me busy after my parents passed." Thomas noticed that her hands, while clearly those of someone who worked, bore no obvious signs of the repetitive needlework that would come from years of sewing. Her fingertips weren't marked by countless pin pricks, and her palms were calloused in a pattern that seemed inconsistent with sitting at a sewing machine for hours each day. The conversation continued in this stilted manner throughout the meal. Elena answered his questions, but her responses felt rehearsed, as if she had prepared for this discussion in advance. When he asked about specific details of her village or family, she provided answers that were generic enough to apply to any number of small rural communities. After dinner, as Elena excused herself to rest from her journey, Thomas sat alone on his front porch smoking his pipe and trying to make sense of his unease. Perhaps he was overthinking things. After all, arranged marriages often began awkwardly, with both parties feeling uncertain about their new situation. It was natural for a woman to be guarded when meeting a stranger she was expected to marry. Yet something about Elena's behavior suggested more than mere nervousness. There was a deliberateness to her actions, a calculation behind her words that made him wonder if she was hiding something significant. The next morning, Thomas woke early to tend to his cattle and found Elena already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She had somehow managed to prepare breakfast without making any noise, and the meal was more elaborate than the simple fare he usually prepared for himself. "You're an early riser," he observed, genuinely impressed by the spread of food before him. "Old habits," she replied. "In my village, the day began before dawn." As they ate, Thomas decided to test his growing suspicions with a more direct approach. "I'd love to hear you speak some Spanish," he said casually. "I've always been curious about the language." Elena's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Oh, we spoke mostly a local dialect in our village. It wouldn't be the same as what you might expect. Even so, I'd be interested to hear it." She spoke a few words that sounded vaguely like Spanish, but, to Thomas's ear, they seemed hesitant and uncertain. While he spoke no Spanish himself, he had worked with enough Mexican ranch hands over the years to recognize the rhythm and flow of the language, and Elena's attempt didn't sound natural. "Your English is remarkably good for someone from a remote village," Thomas commented, watching her reaction carefully. "The priest in our village taught some of us. He said it would be useful if we ever needed to travel." Throughout the morning, as Elena helped him with various tasks around the ranch, Thomas continued to notice inconsistencies. When he mentioned that one of his horses seemed to be favoring its left front hoof, Elena immediately walked to the animal and lifted its leg to examine the sole with a competence that suggested considerable experience with horses. When he commented on her skill, she claimed that her village had many horses and that everyone learned to care for them. Yet when they passed his small vegetable garden and he pointed out the struggling tomato plants, asking for her advice since she had mentioned growing vegetables in Mexico, Elena seemed genuinely puzzled by the plant's condition and offered only vague suggestions about watering and sunlight. By the third day, Thomas was certain that something was very wrong. Elena's story had too many holes, her skills seemed inconsistent with her claimed background, and, most troubling of all, she seemed to be studying him and his property with the attention of someone gathering information for a specific purpose. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Thomas decided he could no longer ignore his suspicions. "Elena," he began carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me." She looked up from the book she had been reading, and for the first time since her arrival, her guard seemed to drop slightly. "What is it, Thomas? Are you really Elena Vasquez?" The silence that followed stretched for what felt like minutes. Elena closed the book and set it aside, her hands folded in her lap. When she finally looked at him, her expression was a mixture of resignation and something that might have been relief. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not. Thomas felt his heart sink, even though he had been expecting this answer. Then who are you? And what happened to Elena? She took a deep breath before continuing. My name is Carmen Rodriguez, and I'm Elena's cousin. Elena died 3 weeks ago from influenza, just days before she was supposed to leave for Colorado. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had been corresponding with a dead woman, planning a future with someone who would never arrive. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you come in her place? Carmen's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. Because Elena wasn't the only one who needed to escape Mexico, Thomas. And because I thought that if I could just get here, I could make this work somehow. I could be the wife you were looking for, even if I wasn't the one you originally chose. Escape. Thomas leaned forward, his concern overriding his anger. What are you running from? Carmen looked toward the window, as if expecting to see someone approaching the house. That's a longer story, and I'm not sure you want to hear it. It's dangerous, Thomas. My being here puts you at risk, and I'm starting to think that was selfish of me. Tell me, Thomas said firmly. Whatever it is, I deserve to know the truth. Carmen nodded slowly, and when she began to speak, her voice carried the weight of fear and desperation that had been carefully hidden behind her composed facade since the moment she stepped off the train.